Most of us have heard of Pavlov's dogs. Many of us will have heard the term pavlovian conditioning, but what even is pavlovian conditioning and how does it differ from classical and operant conditioning? These are all terms used in learning theory. So before we take a deeper look into the types of conditioning, let's take a look at what learning is. Scientifically, learning is a change in an animal's behaviour as a result of a specific experience. An experience is an event that has occurred in the animal's environment or surroundings. An example can be shown with my own birds while they are on rest period over the colder winter. I tend to feed them later in the evening for no reason other than if I need to do something with one of the birds at some point during the day, at least they haven't yet been fed. As the sun goes down much earlier in the winter, all the birds learn the sound of the garden gate opening once the sun goes down means that they are getting fed. And so they all tend to get a bit more vocal and active awaiting their feed. As I walk up and down the garden multiple times a day to check them without feeding them, they know to just relax and somewhat ignore my presence whilst the sun is up. However, they experienced that when they hear the gate open once the sun has gone down, it means I am there to feed them. They have learned. I have also unintentionally trained this increase in vocalizations and activity within the aviary. A stimulus that is followed by a behaviour that results in a reward will cause that stimulus to encourage that behaviour again in the future. The stimulus is the gate opening after the sun has gone down. The behaviour is to jump around the aviary while being vocal. The reward is being fed their daily ration of food. This is the law of effect. Ivan Pavlov. Rings a bell. No, it doesn't. He never used a bell. I should probably explain what I'm talking about. Ivan Pavlov, a Russian scientist who won a Nobel Prize in 1904, is famous for his research on the conditional reflex and his experiments with dogs and saliva. Pavlov was collecting and measuring the saliva in dogs in response to being fed under different conditions and noticed that some of the dogs would start to salivate before any food had been presented, but when they were in the presence of the technician that fed them. He then put up boards to prevent the dogs seeing the food or the technician until it was presented to them. This is where everyone always says he started to ring a bell, but that isn't true. A bell is far too inconsistent. Pavlov actually began to take a metronome as the dogs were presented with and fed their food. Eventually, the sound of the metronome would cause the dogs to salivate without any food present. Now, why on earth am I talking about a 100-year experiment with dogs in a series about training birds? Well, these experiments with dogs were the discovery of classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is the association of an animal's involuntary reflex with a naturally meaningless stimulus. It is one of the two types of learning that we will be looking at. And it's important to look into classical conditioning as it teaches us some important terminology and offers some insights as to how the learning process occurs. Going back to the experiments, we can start to add some terms. The food the dogs were presented with is an unconditioned stimulus. The presentation of the unconditioned stimulus causes the dogs to salivate. The salivating is the unconditioned response. To the dogs to begin with, the noise of a metronome causes no response. The metronome is a neutral stimulus. Once the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus, the metronome paired with the food, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the dogs salivating at the noise of the metronome is now the conditioned response. There are a few other things learned from these experiments that help us throughout the training process. Sway. The time between the neutral stimulus occurring and the unconditioned stimulus being presented has an effect on the effectiveness of the conditioning. The shorter the better. Classical conditioning can occur both forwards and backwards. Forwards classical conditioning is when the unconditioned stimulus, the food, is presented after the conditioned or neutral stimulus. Backward classical conditioning is when the unconditioned stimulus is presented before the conditioned stimulus. If the conditioned stimulus is presented too many times without the presence of the unconditioned stimulus, the conditioning will break and the conditioned response will disappear. This is called extinction. What is occurring in the brain throughout all of this? When the dog sees and smells the food, the unconditioned stimulus, signals are sent to the brain, causing the salivation reflex to occur to aid the dog with digestion. When the metronome, the neutral stimulus, is played, the ears send signals to the brain, but this causes no response. If these signals are sent to the brain enough times at the same time, new connections are formed in the brain linking the two. So eventually, the signals sent to the brain from the ears at the sound of the metronome causes the brain to activate the salivation reflex. Now, how does this all link back to bird training? In early training, I used classical conditioning to initially train my birds to a stimulus that will help with all of the future training going forwards. I do this with an association to their food. With Sway here, I present him with a piece of food, and every time he eats a piece, I give a whistle. This associates the whistle with getting a piece of food in his mind. Doesn't have to be a whistle. I'm using classical conditioning to link the noise of a clicker to food with Isla, my Caracara, and I'm using a buzzer with Kit, my barn owl. But more on their training in future videos, so make sure you're subscribed. Earlier, I mentioned that there are two forms of learning and training animals. We've looked at classical conditioning, but most of the training we do with animals relies on a different form, operant conditioning. While Pavlov was the man behind classical conditioning in 1901, we now have to jump forward to 1938, where B.F Skinner published his book, The Behaviour of Organisms. Whereas classical conditioning is learning through associations, operant conditioning is learning through consequences. And while classical conditioning works on the involuntary reflexes of an animal, operant conditioning works on the animal's voluntary responses. Pavlov stumbled across his big breakthrough while studying reflexes and digestion, but B.F Skinner set out with an actual hypothesis in mind. His hypothesis was that actions are dependent on the consequences of previous actions. To test this, he created a chamber that rats or mice could be put inside. The chamber contained a lever that, when pressed, would either deposit a piece of food or cause a grid on the floor to shock the rat. This was called a Skinner box. To begin with, the rat or mouse would explore its environment. At some point, it would accidentally step on and pull the lever, meaning a piece of food would be deposited. Quickly, the rat begins to pull the lever regularly, receiving a piece of food. In addition to this, the lever could cause the floor to shock the rat, so the rat would refrain from touching the lever. These two consequences to the rat's actions shows that there are reinforcers that encourage a behaviour to continue through some kind of good experience, and punishments that reduce or prevent a behaviour entirely through a bad experience. In terms of training animals, this can then be split into 4 different categories: reinforcement and punishment, and positive and negative. Positive and negative do not refer to a good or a bad thing. Think of it more like maths symbols. Positive is the addition of something, and negative is the subtraction of something. To best explain these, we need to look at some examples. When I call Peggy over and she flies over to me, I offer her a piece of food. This is positive reinforcement. It's positive because I've added the food reward into the situation. And it is reinforcement because I want her to repeat the behaviour of flying over to me. When working with a new bird that is not comfortable to being touched, I can sit and stroke her with a feather. She can bite and attack the feather all she likes because she doesn't want it to be present. The moment she ignores, I take the feather away. This is negative reinforcement. It's negative because I've removed the feather, and it's reinforcement because I want her to repeat the behaviour of not biting and just ignoring when something touches her. An old, outdated form of training with a new bird would involve the falconer having a mouthful of water that they would spit at the bird if she tries to jump off the glove. This is positive punishment. It's positive because of the addition of the water being spat at the bird, and it's punishment because it's reducing the behaviour of the bird jumping off the glove. If Peggy is out in the field and completely ignores me and refuses to work with me, I could pick her up and take her back in without the typical food reward that ends a session. This is negative punishment. It's negative because I've taken away the typical food reward. And it's punishment because it reduces the behaviour of her ignoring me. Throughout my entire career and throughout this series, we will not be using punishment in any way at all. All of the training is done through reinforcement, and the goal is to use positive reinforcement entirely. As carers of animals, we have a duty to provide the best possible welfare for our animals, and punishing them when they do not understand that what they're doing is wrong is not good welfare practices. Another side to that is that because they do not understand that what they're doing is wrong in our eyes, by punishing them, we break down the trust that is required for a healthy relationship. And a good relationship is very important when training an animal. A very accomplished animal trainer put it like this: trust is like paying into a bank account. The more positive experiences you have with your bird, the higher that trust or bank account will be. But when we punish our animals or cause a stressful environment, we withdraw some of that trust, and we do not want to become overdrawn. In conclusion, classical conditioning is learning through association and acts on the animal's involuntary reflexes, whereas operant conditioning is learning through consequences of behaviour and acts on the voluntary actions of an animal. Both methods are used when training animals, but the limitations of classical conditioning means the majority of training is done through positive reinforcement operant conditioning. In the next video, I will be looking at more of B.F Skinner's work, schedules of reinforcement, and we'll be using this to strengthen the learning process with our birds. Make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos in the series. If you want to see even more content from this series, then make sure to sign up as a member, give the video a like, and leave a comment about what else you would like to see covered in this series. And for now, thank you for watching.